go.
Thanks for coming. I'm not Peter. I'm not Peter Weibersheimer. Hopefully that's clear. I also don't have the training or social skills to be an emergency medicine physician. So I'm a hospitalist. I'm here to talk more from my ethics perspective because I'm one of the ethicists at University of Vermont. I should disclose to you that no one will pay me to say or do anything for them, so I have no conflicts of interest. Most of my pay is involuntary, so. Today's objectives to identify the decision makers in clinical medicine based on the principle of autonomy, and then review legal hierarchy of decision making in patients who've lost decision making capacity. And so just to outline, we'll review some basic definitions, discuss advanced directives and their use, surrogate statutes, which hopefully you guys have heard of at this point, and then substituted interest, which is something that's coming to the forefront of medicine with shared decision making. So some definitions. Autonomy is your ability to act with intention and understanding without any persons or controlling force. It's our idea of informed consent. It's what we hope all our patients are having when they are undergoing decisions. And then there's substituted judgment, which if we can't have autonomy, then we hope for substitute judgment, which is your best guess at autonomy or the best guess at what a patient would have chose. And then if you can't, if you can't predict what the patient would have chose, hopefully you can go through best interest, which is understanding sort of the preferences and the interests of the patient and then coming to a decision that way. And those are the three ways we make decisions in clinical medicine. And of priority and autonomy, I think that makes sense that as a patient, or you want our patients to be making their own decisions. So priority is autonomy, and then it's followed by substituted judgment, which is hopefully from your discussions with patients, their best guess. So other definitions, so these are the decision makers that come to you. Obviously, if you have an autonomous patient, your patient's a decision maker. Second in line would be an agent, which is the durable power of attorney, or healthcare proxy, and that's appointed by the patient. And then you have surrogates, which is generally appointed by the clinician, whether it's through a statute or at the bedside. And then guardians, which are appointed by the court. And hopefully it's a little obvious that agents take precedence when it comes to all of these decision makers because they're appointed by the patient. So if you have an agent, if a patient picks someone to make their decision, that's an autonomous decision. They feel that that person can make that decision. Thus, agents are first in line for a decision when a patient loses their clinical decision making. Followed by surrogates, and then lastly by guardians, because naturally if they're appointed by the court, they generally don't know the patient that well because they've usually exhausted all surrogates when appointing a guardianship by the court. So we'll go through this case, and it stays similar throughout. It's an 89-year-old man with a history of diabetes, hypertension, coronary artery disease, who's in acute respiratory failure due to sepsis from pneumonia. He requests to you that he does not want to be intubated. He does not have an identified decision maker, and he does not have any advanced directives. I don't have an audience response system, but hopefully you're all listening that the decision maker in this instance is our patient, right? So I often have my residents say, oh, but their son said this and their wife said this. I'm like, well, what did the patient say? If your patient can talk to you and have capacity to make a decision, then they are your decision maker. So you don't have to keep looking for advanced directives, looking for healthcare proxy. Your patient is your decision maker. So next is the same gentleman, except he has a history of dementia. You're not able to elicit his goals of care, and just for the sake of simplicity, he doesn't have capacity to make this decision on goals of care. He doesn't have a healthcare proxy, but he has advanced directives that are explicit that he would not want life-sustaining therapy. So hopefully this is easier as well. When you have advanced directives, they're autonomous in the sense of the patient has made these directives while they were able to make decisions. And because of that, you're honoring autonomy by following the advanced directives and not intubating. So advanced directives do equal autonomy. The tricky thing about advanced directives is, I think everyone recognizes Terry Schiavo. She was in Florida for a very long time after complications after cardiac arrest, and there was a big legal battle between her husband and her parents about whether or not to withdraw life-sustaining support because she did not have advance directives. So there was this big push to get advance directives, and there were living wills. And I don't know if you guys have seen living wills, but they're very vague. They say in the event of a terminal illness, which it's almost futility. It's almost how we can't even define futility sometimes at the bedside. Living wills are very vague. So I don't mean living wills when I say elicit advance directives. Advance directives, if you want them to be clearer as you're writing them or as you're part of writing them up for your patients, they should be more clear about what a patient would want. You know, and a lot of times I'll focus on goals of care, nursing facilities, where they want 24-hour care, things like that. So I'm not really necessarily pointing towards living wills, but the case in Florida really highlighted and had a big push for living wills. And then here's healthcare agents. So part of advance directives is designating a healthcare proxy. It's important to know that not many patients have advance directives. And like I said, some of the, if they do have advance directives, oftentimes they are vague. But they are the most autonomous, without having a voice, the most autonomous thing we can use in terms of understanding what our patients want. And it's, I'm sure it's obvious that you guys know that as patients enter the hospital, they lose capacity for decision making, and particularly in the critically ill, our patients majority of the time don't have decision making capacity. So in this case, it's the same gentleman. You're not able to elicit his goals of care. His son is his agent, so he has designated his son to be his healthcare proxy to make his autonomous decisions. His son is requesting intubation, but you have explicit advance directives that say he does not want life-sustaining therapy. So this is tricky. It's not tricky in a PowerPoint, though. In a PowerPoint, if you have illicit advance directives, that is his autonomous decision. The healthcare agent only takes place when you don't have an understanding of the patient's autonomy. If he has explicit advance directives that say that he would not want to have life-sustaining therapy, you don't need the son's decision-making in this aspect. I'm not saying this is easy, though, at the bedside. We've had this happen at the hospital, and it becomes a challenging conversation with the son to understand, well, tell me why you feel at this time that he would want this, despite having said in the past that he didn't. And oftentimes the children, it's a hard discussion, but you can follow the advance directives because that's their autonomy. So again, in this case, we have autonomy because we have advance directives that explicitly say that we don't have that, so you don't even have to move to substituted judgment. So another case, same gentleman, he does not have an identified decision maker or advance directives, but he has a close friend accompanying him to the hospital that states he would not want to be intubated. So you have a close friend at the bedside, no children at the bedside, and states he would not want it. So he's hopefully showing us his substituted judgment, right? So we've gotten rid of autonomy, our patient can't talk anymore, so now we're looking to say, what would the patient have chosen? The friend, hopefully through a good discussion, says, I know him very well, he's told me that he would never want to be alive on machines, things like that, and he's giving you substituted judgment. So in that case, you would be able to not intubate that patient based on that. That does change, though, state to state, which we'll get to. So again, in this case, we didn't have an agent. He had no healthcare proxy, but we had a surrogate at the bedside. And obviously, we didn't need a guardian because we had a surrogate. So there are these things called surrogate statutes. Vermont doesn't have them. So we operate at the bedside where we try to pick the best interested individual in terms of healthcare and who can give us the best substituted judgment, and that becomes our surrogate. But many states do have these surrogate statutes. I think there's 41 now. The primary purpose is essentially to avoid guardianship. There's a lot of reasons to avoid guardianship. It costs a lot of money, it takes a lot of time, and it can limit your decision making in terms of when you're appointed guardianship. So surrogate statutes, they're executed when the patient has lost decision-making capacity and there's no healthcare agent, so the patient did not designate anyone. And it gives you a priority ladder of who could be the next best decision maker. This is just published in the New England Journal last year on the different states and if they have a surrogate statute. you'll see that state to state it can vary, and the latter varies. In some states include domestic partners, some states do not. Some states, if they do include domestic partner, it falls under children, parents, things like that. And so it really does vary state to state. And in this article, they talk about this variation and studying this variation to understand how it limits perhaps the patient's autonomy in decision making. But nevertheless, this is the surrogate statutes that are used throughout the nation in order to legally say what I think we've all been saying at the bedside, which is who's the best decision maker. If there's no decision maker, you look up to what your state says, and it gives you the decision making ladder. I know you guys can't see this because I was sitting all the way in the back and I couldn't see the screen that well. But this is just an example. For example, in North Carolina, the ladder goes spouse, parent, siblings, close friend, physician. Physician is left on and off on several of the ladders, and then it talks about the limitations of those types of decisions. And some of those decisions can be, still can be limiting to life-sustaining therapy. So it's important, if you don't have a good decision maker, and you have no healthcare agent, that when you're looking at your statutes to understand the limitations of what that surrogate can make. And why avoid guardianship? We talked about time and money and less autonomy base. Here in Vermont, guardians cannot withhold life-sustaining therapy unless death is imminent within 24 hours. And so in Vermont, if you want to change any life-sustaining therapy, you have to go back to the courts to make that decision. In Vermont, surrogates can make those decisions. So that's one reason to avoid guardianship. But again, also time and money. And like I said, in terms of the surrogate statutes, in state to state it varies, and in different states it might limit those decisions.
Just to clarify that, in Vermont, if you called somebody, with that old guy, and said his SAT's 80%, you're his guardian, he's likely going to die in the next 6 hours if we don't intubate him.
Right.
That's less than 24 hours, so they could say don't intubate him then?
No, they have to be terminal. So he's saying that, can you call your guardian, if you have a legal guardian, you have a guy with pneumonia who potentially could get extubated and then, still live in a nursing, maybe 24/7 care, things like that. You can't limit their care unless, they're truly going to die no matter what. That's how we do it, So they can't restrict their life-sustaining therapy in that sense. Now, if you have a guy in the ICU on 4 pressors, where if you code them it's still not going to be realistic, then you could withhold that without going back to the courts. So same gentleman has acute respiratory failure due to pneumonia, doesn't have an identified decision maker, doesn't have an advance directive. His son is at the bedside and he said he doesn't know what his father would want. And I think this happens a lot as well. So in looking at this decision making, there have been a lot of talks about surrogate decision making. Unfortunately, even with surrogate decision making, you talk about if the conversations aren't present with the patient, that oftentimes are the decisions they make. We say they're almost the same as chance. Are they making the right decision for the patient? So even though we have all these discussions with patients, oftentimes the decision still in some of our surveys show that the patient might have wanted something different 40% of the time. Not only that, but there's a big burden on decision on surrogates, which is such a conflict, right? So you designate a surrogate to make the decision easier so that the patient can, hopefully there's some autonomy to their decision making, but the surrogate has this great burden that actually they say it's similar to post-traumatic stress in some of these really heavy decisions. And how can we make that easier? This is just talking about some of the stressors that surrogates go through and some of the responses. What I found at the bedside that makes it easy, at least when I talk to surrogates, first of all, you have to understand that these decisions are hard for the patients and their families and their loved ones, is supporting them. And what I'll say is you're doing the right thing. It's something simple like that. Sometimes we get the answer and we just kind of walk out of the room, but telling them they're doing the right thing can really go a long way to some of that stress that they're having, because that's sometimes all they need to hear is that they're doing the right thing. And so what they talk about is offering them some counseling, and then that guilt is going to be there regardless of how strong they seem at the bedside, and it's just offering that they're doing the right thing, that it sounds like, that they know their loved one well and they're doing that for them and making a good decision. A new model that's come up is this shared decision making, which Evie talked about a little bit. So our patients, our surrogates, they don't know as much medical information as we do, but what they do know is they know the patients. And so through different questions, can we elicit some of these, we call them substituted interests. So in substituted judgment, we might say, what would your mother choose if she could tell us? That's substituted judgment. Or what do you think is best for your mother would be best interest. But substituted interest is saying, well, tell me more about your mother. Tell me about what she's been through in her life. Tell me about, has this ever happened in your family? In those instances, did she say anything? Did you ever say anything about leaving her home and not being in a nursing home? Things like that. And so walking them through this, and then determining from that surrogate what their loved one might want, just through talking through their life story and